Hello everyone again. Welcome to the eighth Freethought History Webinar. I kept thinking it was the ninth for some reason, but it's definitely the eighth. There's been so many now. I'm Daniel James Sharp. I'm the editor of the Freethinker and your host this evening. On screen at the moment, you should be able to see our website and social media links. If you haven't already, please do give them a gander. Just so you're aware, this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our website and YouTube channel afterwards. Just very briefly, how this webinar will work. I'll soon hand over to our guest who will give a presentation, and then we shall open it up to the audience for questions, comments, and so on and so forth. So our guest tonight is Lucie Lemieux, as I'm sure you all know. A retired health professional with experience in women's health and international health. She's currently pursuing a master's degree in history with a concentration in feminist studies at the University of Quebec in Montreal. I was going to try and do the French pronunciation, but I decided I'd better not embarrass myself. Tonight, Lucie will be speaking about Annie Besant, a pioneering secularist and feminist of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So with that, I shall hand it over to you, Lucie. And thanks
Thank you,
for
Danny.
being here.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll just add that I first came across Annie Besant's name decades ago when I was in my 20s and interested in Eastern philosophies and religions. But then she sort of fell off on the wayside. And her name came up again a couple of years ago when I took a course on women and religion. And a guest speaker mentioned her name as one of a few women who were not Hindu or Indian and had influenced Hinduism. And theosophy wasn't mentioned at the time. And I was a bit intrigued and I Googled her. And of course, I discovered that there was quite a bit more to Annie Besant than theosophy. And that's what led me to want to know more about her and embark on a master's degree about her time with the Secular Society. I traveled to London in the fall, in October, to consult the Conway Hall archives, and I met Robert Forder, who suggested that I might give a webinar on Annie Besant. So this is how I've ended up speaking to you today. So I will start the webinar with 3 slides, and then I'll just be talking after that. But they'll be the first 3 slides that I think to myself as Annie Besant in a nutshell. So perhaps, Danielle, if we can look at the first one. So Annie Besant, she was born Annie Wood in 1847 in a middle-class family that actually ran into financial difficulties after the father's death when Annie was but a child. But the mother agrees that Annie could pursue a solid education from Miss Ellen Marriott, who, in addition to traditional subjects, including German and French, she taught strong self-education methods. She was an evangelical woman, but open-minded, and Annie Besant just thrived on the teachings that she was receiving from her. At age 20, Annie Wood marries an Anglican pastor, Frank Besant, and her religious questioning that actually had started before the marriage, but the unhappiness in the marriage led to their separation in 1873. She was questioning increasingly the work that her husband was doing. And he eventually gave her an ultimatum that she should behave as a proper parson's wife or she should leave. And she chose to leave. With the help of her brother, who had trained in law, she obtained in 1873 a formal separation, by virtue of which she had custody of their daughter Mabel, while the son, Digby, remained with his father. She was 26 years old, and this was a very difficult situation for a woman in Victorian England. But there wasn't much that was not up to Annie Besant's capacities. So then she became a member and one of the leaders of the National Secular Society from 1874 to 1890. drew closer to socialism in the 1880s and became a member of the Fabian Society in 1885. She becomes a theosophist in 1889 and moves to India in 1895, where she continues her social and political activism. She dies in India in 1933. My presentation today will not cover her action in India or as a theosophist, nor much about her socialism, as the subject of my work is really her contribution to free thought when she was, and to secularism when she was a member of the NSS. So we can look at the next slide, which I used to illustrate how I think of her mental process as she moves through her deconversion and into a more publicly active life. So she starts with the religious questioning because of the incoherences that she notes in the Gospels, but also her witnessing of suffering and injustice, and particularly, but not only, but particularly the suffering of her daughter Mabel, who had a serious illness that she almost died of. And I think that was for Besant, that was intolerable, and certainly could not be reconciled with an infinitely good and infinitely powerful God. So these questionings, the religious questioning, brought her closer to intellectual and scientific exploration, but also further religious exploration. She reads major writers in theology, whether it's Mansell or Francis Newman. She moves closer to the freethinkers, Thomas Scott, Moncure Conway, Charles Voysey, and pursues intellectual and scientific exploration. For her, this is the way to make meaning of the world, is to try to understand how things work. But through her education and her strong religious feelings and the injustice and suffering that she's witnessed, she retains a sense of the importance of morality and of brotherhood. And the brotherhood for her includes women, but it's a major driving intention for her and throughout her life. So all this together moves her to be active in the public space. She's an activist, she's a fighter, so she's going to be active in the world with publications, conferences, trials, and support of various causes. And we can perhaps look at the next slide, which I think of as probably best described as a mission statement. This is from her autobiography, written in 1893. And she says that in 1875, I resolved to give myself wholly to propagandist work as a freethinker and a social reformer, and to use my tongue as well as my pen in the struggle, to spread liberty and truer thought among men, to war against bigotry and superstition, to make the world freer and better than I found it, that I would read and study and would train every faculty that I had, that I would polish my language, discipline my thought, and widen my knowledge. And I think this quote shows a determined woman who conceives of the written and spoken word as action, strives to improve herself and the world around her, and realizes that this will require work and discipline. And I think that really summarizes or presents Annie Besant quite efficiently. So from now on, I'm going to look at what her contribution has been both to secularism through the National Secular Society and to the rights of women. And perhaps we can dispense with the projection now, Danielle, because I think it's going to be more convivial if we're just looking at each other. But her first steps with the National Secular Society happen in 1874 when she meets Bradlaugh. She becomes a member, and fairly soon after she meets Bradlaugh, he offers her a position on the National Reformer, which she takes with much satisfaction because it's intellectual work, which she's inclined to do, and also it brings her more income than the small stipend that she was getting from Frank Besant for the custody of Mabel. So she begins work for the National Reformer in 1874 with a column that she will keep writing until 1890. And already in August 1874, she gives her first conference, the subject of which is the political status of women. which is a big success. It's acknowledged in the press, and it's published as a pamphlet that same year. Her second conference is on the true basis of morality. And again, as I pointed out, morality for her is a major virtue or a major quality. And she will be very concerned about, and this is what secularists also and freethinkers are keen to do, is to demonstrate that freethinking is a moral position, whereas freethinkers and atheists are often perceived as being immoral, but there very much is a lot of arguments on the part of freethinkers to prove that, in fact, it's a moral position. But moving on, I'm going to go fairly quickly over what she did, because she did so many things and published so many pamphlets and was very active. So I can't begin to talk about all that she did. So I had to select a few things. So of course I have to talk about the trials. She was involved in two very resounding trials. The first one in 1877 was about the right to publish information about birth control. It started off as a pursuit against the publication of a Knowlton pamphlet on birth control, which was a neo-Malthusian pamphlet saying that to reduce poverty, we need to reduce the number of births, and to reduce the number of births, we can use birth control rather than in the more classical Malthusian approach is to postpone marriage. So this is a birth control pamphlet that the secularists, well, actually Bradlaugh and Besant decide to publish in spite of Watts, who had originally published it, Charles Watts, who withdrew the pamphlet. But Bradlaugh and Besant will start a publishing company to publish the pamphlet and really trigger the trial. And even though this was a very difficult time for the National Secular Society, because there is a rift between Bradlaugh and Watts, because Bradlaugh sort of dismisses Watts more or less because Watts will not publish the pamphlet, and Besant and Bradlaugh want to publish it. So they go ahead and publish it, and the trial goes on, and in spite of an ambiguous verdict, they're off on a technicality because the wording of the verdict is not quite what it should have been for a real condemnation and prison term. But the outcome of it is that Besant and Bradlaugh are free, and that the publication can go on. Besant will rewrite this, or she'll write a new pamphlet called The Law of Population, its consequences and its bearing upon human conduct and morals. Here we have morals again. And that's going to be immensely successful pamphlet with more than 150,000 copies distributed. But one of the outcomes of this trial is that, of course, Besant is now acknowledged as being an atheist, because part of her defense, which she carried out herself, Besant and Bradlaugh will defend themselves in the Knowlton trial. And she's now publicly known as being an atheist. So her husband will sue her to regain the custody of Mabel. And he successfully sues her. This is in 1878, and there's an appeal that's heard in 1879. And Annie Besant will lose both of these trials, the trial, the original one, and the appeal. And she will, but then there are several outcomes of this trial that are more positive than just the loss of Mabel, which is major for her. This is a real blow for her own sense of her own self and her happiness. But she publishes, as she prepares to defend herself in this trial, she publishes a pamphlet, and it takes the form first of articles in the National Reformer, Marriage as it was, as it is, and as it should be, a plea for reform. And in that pamphlet, she touches on pretty much all the issues around marriage that feminists will be fighting for, whether it be the marriage laws that cover civil rights and property rights for women once they get married, or very difficult access to divorce for women, no parental rights, no protection against conjugal violence or any rights after leaving a violent husband. She covers all these in the pamphlet. She's probably experienced a lot of that, but she certainly in the pamphlet goes over the jurisprudence, I think this is how you pronounce it, and sort of builds a very dense and very well-informed pamphlet. The fact that she defends herself in these trials is unusual as well. It is something unheard of at the time that a woman would defend herself in court. And this is a time when women were not admitted to university, they could not study law, and they could present their own defense, but they couldn't have defended somebody else. But she defends herself. But everybody is impressed about this. And I think it's worth mentioning that it's only, and this is 1879, it's only in 1919 that with the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, women will be able to act as judges, juries, barristers, and solicitors. So she's way ahead of her time, defending herself, building a legal case, looking at the jurisprudence, presenting this in a very convincing way, even though, unfortunately, the rights of the husband will win over the rights of the wife. One of the things that Besant points out is that she says a mistress who has a child has more rights as a parent than a wife who has a child within a legal marriage. This is just one of the injustices of the marriage law at the time. This is another thing I didn't say earlier. I was so impressed with how all that Besant was able to do in spite of being a woman in Victorian England. I mean, she has so many strikes against her, but she just goes through and does her thing. So just to have more of an overview of Besant's contribution to the National Secular Society, she, of course, participates in the promotion of free thought and of the reforms that the NSS advocated. She's a very successful public speaker and debater. She's a major contributor to the National Reformer, and also is eventually a co-editor of the National Reformer, which means that her name is on the title page of the periodical. She provides organizational support and supports sociability and community building activities. She's one of several vice presidents for about 15 years, from 1875 to 1891. She contributes to ceremonies, whether they be burials or welcoming of newborns, and also to social activities, playing music and general entertainment. She also takes part in the teaching of the Hall of Science, which is also one of her values about learning about scientific exploration, intellectual exploration. So she's both a teacher and a student at the Hall of Science. And of course, her activism in the trials that I mentioned, but she also organizes petitions and demonstrations and fundraising, and of course, lots of support for Bradlaugh when he was trying to occupy his seat as an atheist in the parliament. But of course, she is a controversial figure. But I'll give a few more examples of her contribution to NSS advocacy. The reforms that NSS, the National Secular Society, are proposing. Besant will write about this, she will talk about this, and perhaps she does not create all the information, all of the positions, but she explains them very well, makes them much more accessible, understandable for ordinary members of the National Secular Society or readers of the National Reformer, but also for the other speakers so that they can give better talks. So in foreign policy, she is a strong critic of colonialism and of the use of military power. She has articles in the National Reformer about Afghanistan and the Transvaal and Egypt and the Sudan. She also writes as a critique of the Tory government prior to the 1880 election, which the Tories will lose. She writes a series of 3 articles in March and April of 1880 entitled Shall England Vote Tory? And one article is on finances, another one is on foreign policy, and one is on home policy. And these are all published in the few months leading up to the election that the Tories will lose. She also is very involved in writing about land law reform, which is an issue that the secularists have worked on until perhaps the middle of the 1880s. But in February 1880, the NSS organizes a land reform conferences where there will be 5,000 delegates from various progressive organizations. There will be speeches by prominent figures like Joseph Arch and Michael Davitt, and MPs also who send messages and participate. And Besant is among the National Secularist Society representatives who will speak at the conference. And she publishes she's published several things about land reform, but in January 1880, just prior to the conference, she publishes the English Land System, where she pleads, and this is a position of the National Secularist Society and of Bradlaugh's position as well, to remove the game laws and the primogeniture and entail laws, and to introduce compulsory cultivation or sale of cultivable land, laws leading to the simplification of land transfer, gradual taxation of large estates, and establishment of peasant property. These are reforms that the National Secular Society are pushing for, moving forward, but they will not be able to succeed in this. Even after the reform laws to allow more rural voting and country votes, they won't be able to move forward on these reforms. Besant is also active in freethought advocacy, both in, or not both, but denouncing Christianity's dogmas, practices, and institutions, and proning disestablishment of the church in England, Wales, and Scotland. And she writes extensively on defending the morality of atheism. And she's one of the NSS delegate to International Freethought Federation conferences, the one in 1880 where the International Freethought Federation was established, and also in 1881 when the conference happens in London, where Besant will give a report on the separation of church and state in England. And it's interesting to note that the European freethinkers, because the Freethought Federation, International Freethought Federation, includes many European freethought organizations as well as Americans. But she is known amongst the European freethinkers because of the trial where she lost custody of her child because of her atheism. So she's already a figure who is known in Europe for her position on freethought. So that's, again, this is very brief, just a few things about what she does for the National Secular Society. But I also want to talk about what she has done in support of women's rights. So in the middle of the 19th century, there emerges a movement that didn't call itself feminism at the time, but it's accepted now to call it feminism. It's mostly middle class and staunchly respectable women who make up this movement. And they fight for a number of issues that are pertinent particularly to middle-class women. More working class issues will come in the later decades of the century, but first of all, they work on access to secondary and post-secondary education. They figure this is a primary step towards equality for women. But of course, reform of the marriage laws. Women from the middle classes were particularly unhappy, to say the least, about marriage property, how married women could not own property. They had no civil or legal existence. They had no, again, as I mentioned earlier, very little rights over parenting their children, and very few rights if they were to leave a violent husband, or there was lots of issues around marriage. And but apart from these women who are in what I call the mainstream feminist movement in England at the time, there are many women who fight for women's rights, but they're not part of or accepted by this mainstream group. And among others, we find several women who are close to the secularists or freethinkers. Harriet Law, among others, who is a speaker and a publisher of the Secular Chronicle. There's also Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy, who lives in a free union with Ben Elmy, who is one of the vice presidents of the National Secular Society. And when she becomes pregnant or visibly pregnant, her feminist colleagues really pressure her into marrying Elmy so that she would regularize her situation. Because Elizabeth Wolstenholme has been very active in the suffrage movement, in the married women's property movement, as well as in the fight against the Contagious Diseases Act, which I will speak of a little bit more later. Other women who are in a group that Laura Schwartz, who writes a book called Infidel Feminists, names Kate Watts, who is the wife of Charles Watts, who is the publisher of the National Reformer, until there is a rift with Charles Bradlaugh. So in this context, Besant is also part of these infidel women, and she's actually more radical than and unrespectable than mainstream feminists. And so she defends women's rights, but it's hard to strictly call her part of the feminist movement at the time, because the mainstream feminists don't acknowledge her much. Her trial on birth control is not even mentioned in the feminist press at the time. So this is because this is unspeakable. This is not something that can be talked about. So Besant cannot be talked about. So her women's rights advocacy, well, women's suffrage, I've mentioned the Conference on the Political Status of Women that she gives as early as 1874. There will be many attempts to reform suffrage laws, and they won't be successful until 1918. This is for propertied women over the age of 30, but it will be 1928 for all women above age 21, which is similar to men's rights. She also writes a pamphlet called English Republicanism, where she mentions that you can't have real republicanism if women don't have the vote. And I think that's very interesting, and it's unusual for Republicans to promote that. Although the National Secular Society is in favor of women's suffrage mostly or officially, although there are secularists, men, who feel that women shouldn't be given the vote because women are too easily influenced by religion and clergy, and they're not to be counted upon to vote in favor of more progressive representatives or laws. However, women can vote and be elected on school boards as of 1870 and as workhouse guardians. So Annie Besant will present herself and be elected on the London School Board. This is going to be 1888 that she's elected there. And she is very successful in the London School Board. And interestingly, Patricia Hollis, who writes a book called Ladies Elect about women elected on various elected positions in England, talks about how Annie Besant managed to build alliances, has a very successful style. She speaks of sunniness, moral generosity, sincerity, and she's supportive of fellow members, including the Tories, who are a majority on the board at the time. And I find that that's interesting because it's a little different from the image that sometimes comes through about Annie Besant, about how she was ambitious and determined and cold, whereas the image that Hollis gives is quite different. But of course, by that time, Annie Besant has been active for more than 10 years, and probably she's learned a few things about how to make her points come across and win her proposals. So Besant is also, of course, active about marriage and the rights of women. I've talked about her pamphlet on marriage as it was, as it is, and as it should be, which she writes at the time of the trial against Frank Besant. But it's reprinted in 1882. And I think that date is important because the married women properties law or issue is one that the feminists at the time are very keen upon, especially the middle class ones, of course. And there will be, in a period of about 10 years, between 1873 and 1882, about 6 or 7 amendments and laws that are brought before the Parliament. But it's finally adopted in 1882, and Besant's pamphlet on marriage is reprinted in 1882 as part of that campaign in favor of women's rights within marriage. And there'll be several other acts and amendments in favor of women's rights within marriage that occur over those years. The Matrimonial Causes Act in 1878, which gives a little bit more power for women to get divorce. The Married Women Property Act in 1882, which finally satisfies the feminists. The Guardianship of Infants Act in 1886. And Married Women (brackets Maintenance in Case of Desertion) Act in 1886. These are all points that Besant raised in her pamphlet on marriage. Another issue that she's very active and writes about is the Contagious Diseases Act. So these acts, which are voted in the 60s, 1864, 66, 69, they're voted and they allow for the police in garrison towns to arrest women on simple suspicion or denunciation of prostitution, force them to submit to invasive tests and exams and treatment, and imprison them should they refuse. The feminist fight against these acts start in the late 1860s under the leadership of Josephine Butler, who is a very devout Anglican woman, but also with Wolstenholme-Elmy at the time, who is also involved in these fights. And the Repeal Act will finally be passed in April 1885. So it takes, again, 20 years of fighting to get rid of these acts that are not particularly helpful for women. And Besant writes about this. She publishes in the National Reformer a series of articles that will be published as a pamphlet, The Legalization of Female Slavery in England. She praises Butler. She lists similar arguments to those advanced by the other feminists. Of course, the issue of habeas corpus, if you can be arrested on the street just because somebody says or thinks you might be a prostitute. The double standard of morality, because, of course, these laws were put in place because there was quite a bit of venereal disease. They're calling it Contagious Diseases Act, but it's because the Victorians cannot think of sexually transmitted diseases. There's a double standard of morality because the idea of these acts is to allow men to continue to frequent prostitutes, but protecting them from the disease by arresting and treating women. And so the sexual activity of women is condemned, whereas the law allows men to have immoral actual sexual activity. Also, there are problems about these laws because they affect mostly lower class women. And the fact also that prostitution is often associated to poverty. And as Besant writes, and I quote, "Remunerative employment would half empty the streets. Pay women," she says, "for the same work, the same wage that men receive." End of quote. And here we are 150 years later, and we're still fighting to get the same pay for the same work. Besant here, again, goes further than the mainstream feminists, however, and she pleads that a standing celibate army makes prostitution almost inevitable and is unnecessary. She thinks that a standing army is unnecessary. And also that more accessible divorce would reduce immorality because people would be able to remarry, men in particular, I suppose, and then would not have to satisfy their sexual urge through the sexual workers' contributions. So the fact that she was so radical has probably contributed to her not being more obviously part of feminist history, though of course she's not the only woman that history has more or less disappeared. So again, as I said earlier, she's a controversial figure. She certainly is a disturbing element in the National Secular Society hierarchy. She's a young woman, she's bold and ambitious, and in spite of these being usually seen as mostly positive characteristics in men, they're not perceived that way in women. And it may be a bit jarring to see these qualities in a woman who is otherwise attractive and feminine. But this is not acceptable. Also, she's a very successful speaker, and she's a strong support of the National Secular Society agenda. but she outshines other speakers, and that also is somewhat unpalatable. She's close to Bradlaugh, and that is also something that does not go down well with the leadership. Her bold insistence to proceed with the Knowlton publication is seen as the cause of the rift between Bradlaugh and Watts, and that also is a major issue in the National Secular Society. And secularists are divided on some of the feminist issues that Besant supports. The suffrage for women, as I said, some secularists don't agree with that. The birth control and the whole Knowlton pamphlet is a difficult time for the National Secular Society. And some of the secularists feel that this is not appropriate, and it's not likely to be a winning case, and there's lots of hesitation around that. The CD Act, the Contagious Diseases Act, is also something that divides secularists to some extent. Secularists are, of course, more individualists, and they're not prone to approving of the state interfering with private affairs, which this whole issue of legislation legalizing around prostitution is not well received. So that also is a difficult one, although secularists are also in agreement with the repeal of these laws, and they will accept to have speakers in favor of repeal speak at their clubs, at secularist and radical clubs. So there's a bit of a division there. Of course, her move to socialism is something that is not well received by Bradlaugh and Foote, certainly, and probably others in the hierarchy, in the leadership of the National Secular Society. And her adoption of theosophy is probably the last straw for many secularists, and it's perceived as a treason. So these are some of the issues, and probably contributed to her, let me just, right, to tarnish her image and reduce the memory of her contribution. And Foote, who succeeded Bradlaugh as NSS president, certainly did not wish Annie Besant's contribution to be acknowledged or remembered. I think that they all felt that if the less spoken about her, the better. But that's my impression. So, and again, as I said, apart from her contribution to the dissemination of birth control information, she's little remembered in feminist history as well. And I think that these were the things that intrigued me at the beginning, that she did so many things, and then we didn't know much about her. So that was a bit a reason for me to try to know more about her. So just a few words now about Annie Besant after the National Secular Society. So she, of course, continues her writing and proselytizing when she's a theosophist. She continues her social and political activism in India and in Britain. And she continues to hope for improvement in humanity. The link with the values that I described at the beginning, and also with her belief in evolution, which had already had an influence on her adoption of socialism. She felt that socialism was something that humanity was moving towards, was evolving towards. But her adoption of theosophy, I think, is not without meaning in view of her attachment to brotherhood, which was not, the brotherhood thing is not necessarily shared by secularists. And she was also, in that regard, a bit disappointed in socialism, which she felt couldn't move ahead if humanity didn't improve. So she still hoped to improve humanity. This was part of her mission statement, as I said, and felt that theosophy offered a way to achieve that more than either secularism or socialism. And only by improving humanity could a more generous society and a more equal society emerge. So I think that she is an inspiring figure. She was brave and she was determined. And there's a quote that I like that comes from her pamphlet on marriage, where she says, "Reforms have never been accomplished by reformers who had not the courage of their opinions." And I think that might be a quote that would be useful for us now at a time when we need reform. So I thank you for your attention. And I would like to hear your questions and comments. Danielle, I think you can pick up from here.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand or use the raise hand function. But just to quickly butt in, as I usually do, I usually exercise my prerogative to ask the first question. I wonder if you have any thoughts on Annie Besant's legacy among secularists today, not so much scholars, but active secularists who might shy away from her because of her turn to theosophy.
Well, I think that it's possible to see her turn to theosophy as meaningful in terms of improving the world for all of us. And I think moving away from too much arbitrariness. Although, again, I think it's a difficult question you're asking me. I think what we need to remember from her is her courage, she clings to her opinions and she seeks for the truth, and she's not going to let go until she finds it. And I think that's probably what we need to remember. That's what free thinking is about.
All right. I saw Edward Royal with his hand up, so I shall ask you to unmute. I think you need to. Yeah.
Where to start on that? First of all, I was surprised you didn't mention her trade union work and particularly the Match Girls strike. I'd have thought that if you're talking about her place in general history, that is where you will find Annie Besant's name, organizing the Match Girls. But really what I wanted to contribute, I wanted to, first of all, I agree with practically everything you have said. She was, I think, probably one of the greatest female public speakers of the 19th century. My aunt, who heard her speak in Manchester Free Trade Hall when she was an old woman, probably speaking on India in the late 1920s, said what a spellbinding speaker she was even then. But let's not carry it away. She was not a saint. I think she rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way because she was very much the middle class madam. And in a working class movement, there was a certain amount of resentment. In particular, there's the friction with Kate Watts. Kate Watts is the leading lady of the secularist movement, and she sees her husband being trashed, as it were, and this woman coming in and driving a wedge between her husband and Bradlaugh. And I think it's quite understandable how they disliked this intruder who was breaking up the group which had founded the National Secular Society. And Kate Watts is probably more underestimated than Annie Besant. But the biggest criticism I would make of Annie Besant is you look at what she wrote, looking back on her loss of Mabel, and also looking back on the Bradlaugh case. And the conclusion she draws, the judge who ruled against custody of Mabel was a Jew. One of the leading MPs against Bradlaugh, Henry Drummond Wolff, although an impeccable evangelical Christian, was a Jew of a Jewish family. And what she writes about Jews generalizes from these individuals to general statements about Jews, which we would only call anti-Semitic today. And I think we can't close our eyes to the fact that there is anti-Semitism in her approach. So,
well, yeah, a lot to chew on there. Yeah, Lucie, do you have any thoughts?
No, I thank you, Mr. Professor Royal, for these comments. I think you're very right about the matchmakers' strike, how important Besant's support for the strike and other strikes. I mean, she wrote about the trade union movement, and she certainly is a significant person in that. And no, I think you're quite right. I think anti-Semitism is a difficult point. It probably was fairly common at the time, and she didn't escape that. I think she certainly had some of the faults of her time, and she was a forward woman and could probably, as you said, rub people the wrong way. I no doubt about that. I think that's part of, I guess that's the flip side of being, determined and moving ahead, whatever the opposition is, and not necessarily taking the time to be more in tune with the feelings of people around her.
Yeah, well, there was the I can't remember who it was. I'm sure, Edward, you can tell me. The was it Foot or somebody who complained about no, it wasn't Foot, who complained about this odious Jew production, the Bible, something like that.
That was Charles Southwell.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But people who say this is anti-Semitism, that is absolute rubbish, because if you had gone to the South London Hall where Southwell also appeared as an actor, you could have gone to a performance of The Merchant of Venice, where the lead character Shylock is played by Charles Southwell, and he ran the production to show the anti-Christian side to it. That here was this poor Jew who was being duped and taken for a ride by these Christians. Now, does that fit in with a man who is determined to be anti-Jewish? I just can't see it.
Okay. Well, I shall defer to you. I was just trying to make the point that maybe there are some other strains among others of the time, but perhaps not. But yes, anyway, nobody's perfect in history, it must be said. But I shall move on to Bob Forder, who's got his hand up as well. I think we can't hear you. Yeah, you're not muted, but your mic isn't on.
How's that?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Lucie. Excellent presentation. Really grateful to you. I've noticed Edward mentioned the Match Girls strike, and this book influenced me a lot on that subject by Louise Raw. It has a rather sort of unique, or perhaps not unique, but the research she carries out is rather different from most research, because she interviews descendants of the match women, as she calls them, rather than match girls, for a lot of her evidence. But why I'm waving it around is because I think the book also says quite a lot about Annie Besant, in the sense that Louise's thesis is very much that Annie Besant took far too much credit for the Match Girls strike. She was somebody who was inclined to push herself forward at the expense of others, and a lot of what she did was extremely performative, and that is perhaps troubling. And I do have a problem, actually, and perhaps this is the question, and perhaps you can help me with it, Lucie. I just find it completely inexplicable how somebody can abandon free thought and become a theosophist. I just don't understand the mental gymnastics that you can go through to achieve that, and to disown really everything you stood for and the people who were loyal to you, to the extent, just for example, of having fought that momentous trial over Fruits of Philosophy, the birth control pamphlet, then to write a replacement of that pamphlet to bring it up to date, essentially, and then to withdraw the copyright for it as you left the secularists, completely abandoning everything you stood for. I just can't understand how she did that. I'm sorry, that's too long a question in the end, but that's the point I wanted to come to.
Yes, in her speech, her talk, Why I Became a Theosophist, she explains that she continues to seek for the truth, and that's the explanation she gives. And she's explaining that she has to give up. She has not been able to explain from a materialist point of view some realities that she's confronted with, like hypnosis and dreams or similar unexplainable psychological realities. So she's moving away from the materialist side of things, and I think that's part of the movement. Interestingly, if you look at, there's a book by Jacqueline Lalouette on Freethought in France, where she separates freethinkers into basically two groups. There's a group of theists and spiritualists, and there's a group of atheists and materialists. And these are both freethinkers. These groups are both freethinkers. And I find that it's as if Besant has sort of flipped from one side to another, being disappointed with the materialist, the lack of material explanations for things that she was seeing. So she certainly wholeheartedly adopts whatever new sense of what the truth is. She's moving in those things. She's not a nuanced woman. I think that's the understatement. But also, I would plead that at that time, and even now, women who are strong-willed, women who move into the world, who disregard a little bit conventions and who are not feminine in that sense, they're not well received. They're not understood. And that's part of the aura that surrounds her. One thing that I found interesting about Louise Raw is that, yes, I agree with you, it's a very interesting historical exercise to find these people. The sources are so interesting. But no, even though she says that Besant didn't have that big a role in the success of the strike, I'm not sure that it is Besant that claimed to have had a big role. I think others around her did. And I think that there's a bit of a nuance there that we should remember. I think that I don't think Besant actually claimed to have led that strike. She gave support, and she rallied the Fabians and the socialists to give support, and also got the things out in the press. So she used the levers that she could use, and to make to make the defense of that strike moving, these women being successful in gaining somewhat better employment conditions. So I think that, but I agree with you, Louise Raw's book is very interesting, but really when I read it, I wasn't convinced that it was Besant putting forward her own role in it. But it's been attributed to her, that's correct, yeah.
I think, well, I suppose it depends on how one defines freethinker, but that's another big subject for another day, perhaps. I see Bill Cook has his hand up.
Oh. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just on the discussion of Annie Besant finding free thought unsatisfactory. What does that tell us about free thought? Is there something, a conclusion we can generally reach, that she found, as you said, the limitations of a materialist worldview? Mm-hmm. Is this saying something about her latent religiosity that never really went away? Or is it saying something about a fundamental weakness in the free thought message that fails to resonate with a large number of people?
That's a good question. I don't think she gave up on free thought, because in that speech on
Yeah,
why I
yeah,
became a theosophist, she says, if
yeah.
anybody in the world should understand what I'm doing, it should be free thinkers. And I think there she makes a difference between free thinkers and secularists, but I'm not going to go into
Yeah,
that.
no, that's a good point.
And Jacqueline Lalouette also quotes somebody from Switzerland called Seai, I forget his first name, she classifies him as in between what she calls the theists and spiritualists and the atheists and materialists. And he calls for a society where for free thinkers, where you would not be considered, let me just remember the quote properly because I haven't written it down. If you don't believe if you're an atheist, you shouldn't be seen, free thinkers should not see you as a scoundrel. And if you believe in God, they shouldn't see you as an idiot or a fool. So he is also thinking, well, free thinkers should be very open-minded about whether you think there is a God or not. But I still think that Besant didn't believe in a God. And I still think, but I haven't really studied her theosophy writing, so I shouldn't be moving at all into that direction. My sense is that she was not convinced that there was a God. And she still felt that what she described was still the natural world. And I think this is also something that is one of the things that free thinkers say or claim, is that there's nothing outside of the natural world. And Besant thought that everything that she described was part of the natural world. But I don't want to go too much into this because it's thin ice for me.
All right, I think time for just one more. And I see John Sargent has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed your talk. Can you tell me a bit more about her move to India, and particularly whether that follows on from the discussions we've been having about her changing views?
Well, I think she was attracted to the Eastern religions. She attends Moncure Conway's talks on Hinduism and I think on Buddhism. He gives talks when he's in the South Chapel, I think. This would be in the 70s. And so she learns, she's curious about this. She's very, and I think that links also with her religiousness, her interest in religious realities and issues and thought. And I think she thinks that the ancient, and this is very much theosophy. This is Blavatsky's point that the Eastern religions are really the source of all wisdom, etc. So I think that's what attracts her to India. She may also have been found herself not particularly comfortable in England at the time. She had turned away a lot of people from her. She'd made former friends become no longer friends, and probably was not too unhappy to be somewhere else. And then after she arrives in India, after a couple of years, she resumes her activism and her political and social activism. And I think that's her chasser le naturel, il revient au galop. I think she's an activist at heart, and she continues to be an activist in India.
Thank you. That figures.
I think Bob has one last comment, so I shall allow him the stage.
It is just a comment. I noticed Barate MG has been sent a message to everyone. In fact, the next webinar, of course, is Barate himself talking about secularism in India. So that connects rather well to the last question.
You stole the words from my mouth. I was about to mention that the next webinar is incidentally on Bradlaugh and India. So I imagine Annie Besant might get a mention in that. But I think now that we're at the hour, that seems a natural conclusion. I've put up on the screen our websites and social media things again. You can sign up for our newsletter, check out our historical archive of issues going all the way back to 1881. And if you're feeling generous, you can also donate. We are a very small and independent publication, so any and all support is very much appreciated. And with that, I think I shall say thank you again to everyone for turning up, and thank you especially to Lucie for such an interesting, thought-provoking, discussion-provoking presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.